Alexander Carter stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, gazing out over the city skyline as the sun dipped below the horizon. His thoughts were clouded by the elegant cream-colored envelope resting on the polished wooden desk behind him. It was an invitation to his ex-fiancée, Victoria's, wedding. The woman who had once been the love of his life, now marrying another man. It stung more than he cared to admit, even though he'd ended things with her. He hadn't been able to commit, always too focused on his business empire and the weight of his family's expectations. But he couldn't deny the gnawing sense of loss that lingered within him. His hand brushed across the paper, feeling the raised script of her name, a mocking reminder of what he had once thought would be his future. As he studied the invitation, a wave of defiance surged through him. He refused to let Victoria see that her leaving him had affected him so deeply. He wasn't about to sulk in private or drown himself in self-pity. It was then that his assistant, Sophie, entered the room, carrying a stack of files, her footsteps light but steady. Sophie, with her dark hair always pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing modest office attire, was the picture of professionalism. Her presence, though often overlooked by others, had always brought a sense of calm to his otherwise chaotic life. Today, however, she seemed to carry an air of quiet tension. "Sophie," Alexander said, his voice steady but laced with an underlying challenge, "I need a favor." She raised an eyebrow, sensing something unusual in his tone. "Of course, Mr. Carter. What do you need?" He stood and faced her, his eyes narrowing as he formulated his next words. "I'm going to Victoria's wedding." Sophie blinked in surprise, her mind quickly trying to process the implications. Victoria's wedding was a significant social event, and Alexander had been publicly invited. But why would he go with Sophie by his side? He had every reason to attend the event to show that he wasn't bothered by the situation, but to bring Sophie? That wasn't like him. "I'm going to need you there with me," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "You'll accompany me as my date." Sophie's expression shifted between surprise and uncertainty. She wasn't exactly sure what his motives were, but she knew better than to question him. She had been working for Alexander for over a year now, and in that time, she'd learned to navigate his moods, his unpredictable decisions, and his often inscrutable nature. I don't understand, Mr. Carter. Why me?" Sophie asked, though she already had an inkling of why. She had always been the quiet, competent assistant who kept the business running smoothly. But to be by his side at a high-profile event, especially one so personal, felt like a step into unfamiliar territory. Alexander hesitated for only a moment, then spoke again, his voice a mix of determination and practicality. "You're the best person for the job, and I'll compensate you well for your time." The offer of money and the promise of a bonus for her time and efforts made Sophie pause. She had been struggling with mounting expenses, rent, bills, and the pressure of managing her own small debts. The additional income would ease the weight on her shoulders. But there was more at stake than money. She had always been careful to keep a professional distance, but this felt like a step into dangerous territory. Still, she couldn't afford to turn it down. "All right, Mr. Carter, I'll go with you." The deal was made, and as Sophie nodded her agreement, a sense of unease settled in her chest. What had she just agreed to? The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Alexander made it clear from the start that he had certain expectations. Sophie would have to look flawless, impeccably dressed, her hair and makeup on point, and every detail carefully planned. It was more than just a date for her. It was a performance. Sophie spent hours shopping for the perfect dress, but nothing seemed quite right. Alexander had a specific vision, and each outfit she tried on fell short of his standards. His gaze was sharp and unsparing as he assessed each option, his preferences unwavering. "You're not here to blend in," he told her one afternoon, his voice terse as he surveyed her in yet another gown. "You need to stand out, elegant, sophisticated. You need to look timeless." Sophie bit back a sharp retort. She didn't appreciate the objectification, but she knew there was no point in arguing. She had agreed to this, after all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of fittings, Alexander selected a stunning black gown that draped perfectly over Sophie's frame. It was simple yet elegant, highlighting her understated beauty in a way that left her feeling both self-conscious and vulnerable. The gown was a far cry from her usual style, modest, professional, and practical. She looked at herself in the mirror, not quite recognizing the woman staring back at her. "Perfect," Alexander said, his tone approving but distant. "You'll wear that." As Sophie prepared for the event, resentment bubbled within her. It wasn't just the way he treated her. It was the constant feeling of being used, as though she were nothing more than a prop in his carefully constructed world. But she swallowed her pride, knowing that tonight wasn't about her. It was about surviving the evening and collecting the payment that would help her keep moving forward. The wedding was held at a luxurious venue on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling estate with manicured gardens and an opulent ballroom that shimmered with gold and crystal chandeliers. As Sophie arrived with Alexander by her side, she could feel the eyes of the guests on them. It was as if the room held its breath for a moment, captivated by their entrance. Alexander's presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. He was dressed in a sharp tuxedo that fit him perfectly, his usual aura of self-assurance radiating from him. Sophie, beside him, felt a mixture of unease and awe as she walked into the glittering crowd in the black gown he had chosen for her. The dress fit her like a glove, and for the first time that evening, she felt a sense of grandeur, albeit a fleeting one. Victoria stood near the center of the ballroom, exchanging polite pleasantries with her guests. As her eyes landed on Alexander and Sophie, her smile faltered for just a second. There was surprise, and perhaps something deeper, lingering in her gaze. Alexander had always been a powerful figure in her life, and seeing him at her wedding with someone like Sophie at his side stirred something unexpected within her. Sophie could feel the tension in the air as Victoria's eyes lingered on them. The whispers started almost immediately, and Sophie tried to steady herself, focusing on her role. She wasn't here to be a target of gossip. She was here to help Alexander save face, to prove that he had moved on, to show the world that his life had continued on, unscathed. Alexander's hand brushed her back as they walked through the crowd, a subtle gesture that provided her with some comfort. He leaned in, his voice low and steady. "Ignore them. Just stay with me." Sophie nodded, grateful for the quiet reassurance. As they made their way into the heart of the event, she couldn't help but wonder what had driven Alexander to bring her here. Was it truly for appearances? Or was there something more beneath the surface? The reception unfolded in a whirl of chatter and laughter, with guests circling the dance floor, nibbling on hors d'oeuvres, and clinking glasses in celebration. Sophie felt a distinct sense of being on display. The lights were brighter, the glances sharper, and the whispers louder as the night wore on. It was an unspoken rule at events like this. Appearances mattered more than substance, and tonight, Sophie was a carefully curated piece in Alexander's show. The guests' curiosity about her was palpable, but none more so than Victoria, who had remained a few paces away for most of the evening, her smile poised, her gaze flickering between Sophie and Alexander. It was clear that she had noticed their entrance, and now, she had an opportunity to make her presence felt. Victoria, dressed in a sleek white gown that shimmered under the lights, approached the pair with a grace that was almost predatory. Her gaze lingered on Sophie as she drew near, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Alexander," Victoria greeted, her tone cool but polite. "I didn't expect to see you here, let alone with your assistant." She let the word hang in the air, dripping with an insinuation that didn't go unnoticed. "I must admit, I'm surprised. But I suppose one can always count on you to surprise." Sophie straightened, trying to keep her expression neutral. The words stung, but she was practiced in concealing her emotions. Victoria's subtle jab didn't shake her. Instead, it reminded her of why she was here, to play her part and keep her focus. "Victoria," Alexander replied, his voice steady, though Sophie caught the edge of something sharper beneath his calm demeanor. "It's good to see you. And yes, Sophie is accompanying me tonight. She's more than just an assistant." His words hung between them like a challenge, one that was met by Victoria's soft chuckle. "Well, I suppose you've always had an interesting way of making choices," Victoria said, her gaze moving from Alexander to Sophie, Her eyes narrowed with a touch of disdain. But I imagine you've always preferred to surround yourself with people who are useful to you. Sophie's breath caught for a moment, the venom in Victoria's words harder to ignore now. It was clear that Victoria wasn't going to let this go easily. This wasn't just an exchange of pleasantries. It was a battle for power, for control. Victoria, in all her beauty and elegance, was used to commanding attention, used to being the center of Alexander's life. And now, there was Sophie, a woman who had been relegated to the role of his assistant, yet was suddenly standing beside him as his equal in front of the very people who once had her as a rival. Sophie met Victoria's gaze with a calmness that she didn't fully feel. She knew what this was about. It wasn't just about her or Alexander. It was about reclaiming a sense of dominance. But Sophie wasn't about to let herself be undermined by petty insults, no matter how calculated they were. "Thank you for your kind words, Victoria," Sophie said, her voice calm, even pleasant. "But I'm sure you'd agree that we all make choices in life, and they don't always fit the mold others expect of us." The words were simple, but they carried weight, and for a moment, Victoria faltered. Her smile stiffened, and there was a flicker of something, resentment, perhaps, that passed across her face before she quickly masked it with a polite laugh. "Touché," Victoria said, her smile returning but now tinged with something far colder. "I see your feisty side, Sophie. Well, I do hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Alexander, it was nice catching up." With a polite nod, Victoria turned on her heel, walking away with a final glance over her shoulder. Sophie exhaled slowly, her body relaxing just slightly. It was clear that Victoria hadn't expected this level of resistance. Sophie had stayed composed, and that was what mattered. Alexander had been silent through the exchange, his face unreadable, but Sophie noticed the faintest glimmer of admiration in his eyes. She didn't know whether it was for her resilience or something else, but it was there, fleeting though it was. "That went well," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. Sophie glanced at him, surprised by his praise. "You think so?" she replied, her voice still steady but curious. "You handled her with grace," Alexander said, his gaze softening for a moment. Not everyone would have stood their ground. For a split second, Sophie caught something in his eyes, a flicker of respect, perhaps even admiration. It wasn't enough to make her feel comfortable, but it was there, a small victory that she wasn't sure she'd fully earned. Victoria might have made her subtle attack, but Sophie had won the round. It was clear to both of them now. Sophie wasn't a passive participant in this night, and she wouldn't let anyone, especially Victoria, walk over her. The evening wore on, and the tension of the earlier encounter seemed to fade into the background as the music filled the air. A live band had begun to play a soft waltz, the melodies flowing through the room, inviting couples to the dance floor. Sophie tried to blend into the crowd, nursing a glass of champagne, her mind racing with the events of the night. She was aware of Alexander nearby, conversing with some of his associates, but she kept her distance. She didn't belong here in this world of wealth, power, and deception. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. But then, out of nowhere, Alexander appeared at her side. His gaze met hers, and for a moment, the rest of the world seemed to blur away. He wasn't just the boss she worked for. In this moment, he was someone who held her attention, someone who had become more than just a figurehead in her life. "Dance with me," he said, his voice low and commanding. But there was an undertone of something softer, something genuine. Sophie didn't know. She had never seen him this way before, so direct and yet strangely vulnerable in the way he looked at her. She hesitated. "I'm not a dancer, Mr. Carter." "Then I'll teach you," he said with a smirk, offering her his hand. Sophie looked at his hand, then at his face. He wasn't asking. He was telling her. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She could refuse, stay in the background, play it safe. But something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the desire to show herself, to show him that she was more than just an assistant, that she could handle whatever he threw at her. Or maybe it was something more complicated than that, something she didn't quite understand yet. With a deep breath, Sophie placed her hand in his. As they moved to the center of the dance floor, Sophie's heart raced. Her feet were awkward at first, stumbling slightly as Alexander guided her with surprising gentleness. His touch was firm, but not overbearing, leading her through the dance with an ease that belied the tension in the air. For a moment, she allowed herself to lose herself in the music, in the feel of his hand at her waist, the sound of their feet moving together. It was an odd sensation, this blend of discomfort and exhilaration. She had spent so much time protecting herself from the emotions this man stirred within her, but now, in this space, it was hard to deny the pull between them. The dance felt natural in its own way, as if the music was an extension of a deeper connection, one they had never truly acknowledged before. For Sophie, it was like stepping into a new world, where the rules were different, where she was no longer just a background figure, but someone who had the power to change the game. But as the song came to an end, the moment seemed to dissipate, leaving them standing close, their breaths quick, their eyes locked for an instant too long. Alexander smiled, his lips curling at the edges, though his eyes were unreadable. "You did well." Sophie offered a smile in return, though it was fleeting. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." But inside, 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not with him. Not with the life she had worked so hard to build. This dance, this night, was more than just about appearances. It was about discovering new layers, and Sophie wasn't sure if she was ready to uncover all that lay beneath the surface. The wedding ended as all high society events do, at midnight, with a final toast and a slow trickling of guests toward their cars, the last of the champagne being consumed, and the final notes of music fading into the night. But for Sophie, the night was far from over. As the car doors slammed shut and the last guests disappeared into the distance, the weight of what had transpired settled heavily on her shoulders. The emotions that had been swirling inside her, from discomfort to exhilaration, were quickly replaced with a growing sense of unease. As the driver took them back to the sleek glass tower where Alexander's office and penthouse were located, Sophie stared out the window, her mind racing. The night had been a blur of conversations, stolen glances, and pointed comments, but it wasn't just the way she'd felt under the weight of Victoria's barbs or the way Alexander had looked at her during their dance. What unsettled her more than anything was the shift in dynamics, the invisible line she had crossed, the role she had been thrust into, and how much of herself she had revealed. More than once, Alexander's eyes had lingered on her in a way that made her question if he truly saw her, or if she was just another part of his game. She hadn't known what to expect from tonight, but the attention she'd received from the guests had been overwhelming. Victoria's subtle jabs had been easy to deflect, but the whispers and curious glances from others? That was harder to ignore. It wasn't just that Alexander had brought her as his companion. It was that the very act of bringing her, a woman who was just his assistant, had sent shockwaves through the event. People had looked at her as if she were an enigma, a mystery they were desperate to solve. The car finally slowed to a stop in front of the building, and Sophie stepped out with Alexander, her heels clicking sharply on the polished marble floors as they made their way inside. As they entered the elevator, the silence between them felt thicker than usual, suffocating even. "You did well tonight," Alexander said as the doors closed, his voice steady but with an underlying warmth. "I was impressed by how you handled Victoria." His words were meant to be a compliment, but there was something else in them. A note of expectation, perhaps, or even something more unsettling. Sophie wasn't sure. "Thank you," she replied quietly, her hands clasped in front of her as she stared ahead. "It wasn't easy." "No, it wasn't," he agreed, his gaze momentarily flicking to her. "But you handled it." Most people would have cracked under pressure. Sophie couldn't help but feel a strange mix of pride and discomfort. She had held her ground, yes, but at what cost? She had crossed a line tonight, not just with her words but with her actions. She had danced with him. She had stood at his side, watched as the world looked at her, wondering who she was and what her place was in his life. She wasn't naive enough to think it was all about the dance or the compliments. There was a deeper game being played, and she was an unwilling player. As the elevator reached the top floor, Sophie stepped out, moving toward the spacious hallway that led to her office. Alexander followed, his footsteps even and purposeful. She glanced at him briefly, then returned her focus to the hallway ahead. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice more assertive now, "I'd like to speak with you about something." He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Of course, Sophie. What's on your mind?" "I want to understand what's happening," she said, turning to face him fully, her posture straight. "Tonight, it felt like something shifted. I don't know if you realize it, but I wasn't just your assistant tonight. You didn't bring me here just for the wedding. You brought me here because I'm part of some plan of yours." She paused, her pulse quickening. "And I need to know exactly what that plan is." Alexander studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She had expected deflection, some excuse or brush-off, but instead, he met her gaze with an intensity that almost made her take a step back. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "I brought you tonight because I trust you, Sophie," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You've been more than just an assistant to me. You've been my sounding board, my right hand. I've watched you grow in this role, and I know you're capable of more than you give yourself credit for. But I can't deny the truth. I don't just rely on you for your work. I rely on you because I see something in you, something that others don't." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had expected to hear something business-related, something practical, but this was personal. It was almost too much. "Mr. Carter, "No, please," he interrupted, taking a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Call me Alexander. I think we've moved past formalities, don't you?" The way he said her name, the way his eyes seemed to soften just slightly, made her heart beat faster. But she forced herself to remain steady, her mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. "I don't know what to make of this, Alexander," she confessed, her voice shaking ever so slightly. "I'm just trying to do my job, but I can't ignore the tension, the things left unsaid between us. I'm not sure what game you're playing, but I'm not sure I want to be a pawn in it." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Alexander's gaze never wavered, but his face grew more serious. He crossed his arms, considering her words carefully. "I don't see you as a pawn, Sophie," he said, his tone far more measured now. "I see you as someone who can make her own decisions, who can stand her ground, and I respect that. I know I don't make things easy for you, but believe me when I say that you're not just a part of my plan. You're a part of something bigger, something that could change everything." Sophie didn't know whether to believe him or not. The words were both comforting and chilling. It was as if he was trying to tell her that she was important to him, but at the same time, there was an underlying sense of manipulation in his tone. He was a man who always seemed to be in control, who had a plan for everything, and now, he was trying to make her a part of that plan. "I need time to think," Sophie said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I need time to figure out where I fit into this, where I fit into your life. Because right now, I'm not sure if I even belong here." Alexander's expression softened, though his eyes remained intense. He nodded slowly, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "I'll give you all the time you need, Sophie," he said quietly, "but I won't stop trying to prove to you that you belong." Sophie didn't know what to make of that. Was it a promise or a challenge? She wasn't sure. But as she walked away, her mind racing with the implications of their conversation, one thing was clear. Things between them had irrevocably changed, and the road ahead was full of uncertainties. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She wasn't just playing a role in his life. She was something else entirely. And no matter how much she tried to deny it, she couldn't ignore the pull that Alexander Carter had on her. The days following the wedding were a blur for Clara, each one blending into the next as she navigated the tangled mess of emotions Alexander had unwittingly awakened. It wasn't just the tension of the event itself, though that had left its mark. It was the uncomfortable realization that she was no longer just a part of his professional world. She had crossed an invisible boundary the night of the wedding, and now, she felt as though she were teetering on the edge of something bigger than herself. In the days after their return, things had changed. At the office, Alexander's behavior toward her had been more distant, more calculated. He was still the powerful, commanding presence he always had been, but there was a shift, a tension she couldn't quite place. He no longer looked at her with the same casualness, nor did he treat her with the same efficiency. It was as if she were now an enigma to him, something to be solved rather than understood, and that unsettled her more than anything. But for all the confusion swirling around her interactions with Alexander, Clara found solace in her own work. She threw herself into her projects with renewed vigor, determined to prove to herself and to him that she wasn't just a pawn in his games. She had ambitions of her own, dreams that stretched beyond the walls of his office and the confines of her role as his assistant. She had always been driven, but now, more than ever, she felt the urgent need to prove that she could rise on her own merit. It didn't take long for Clara to start making a name for herself in the design world. With Alexander's connections and her own talent, she began securing contracts for freelance work. At first, it was small projects, redesigning office spaces for a few of the smaller companies Alexander had connections with, but soon, her work caught the eye of influential industry leaders who began to seek her out for larger, more prestigious projects. One such project came from a local tech company that was planning to launch a new, eco-friendly initiative. The company's CEO, a young visionary named Emily Carson, had seen Clara's work and reached out directly, asking her to design their new headquarters. It was the kind of project that could launch Clara into the upper echelons of the design world. Clara threw herself into the project with the same passion and drive she always did. Her ideas were bold, innovative, and rooted in sustainability, something that was becoming increasingly important in the corporate world. She spent days and nights sketching plans, meeting with suppliers, and negotiating with contractors. She worked tirelessly, driven by a need to prove not just her talent, but her independence. As the project progressed, Clara's reputation grew. Emily was thrilled with the progress, and soon, the tech company was featured in major design publications, with Clara's name front and center. She was no longer just Alexander's assistant. She was her own person, carving out her own path in a world that had once seemed so out of reach. But even as Clara's career flourished, Alexander's presence lingered in the background. She couldn't escape him. His name was tied to so many of her early projects, and there were still times when she'd catch him watching her from across the room, his gaze inscrutable. He was always there, a constant reminder of her past, of the tangled web they had woven together. But now, it was Clara who held the power. It was Clara who controlled her future. One afternoon, as Clara was preparing for a meeting with Emily about the tech company's headquarters, she received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Clara, Alexander's voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension. I need to speak with you. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers gripping the phone tighter. What about? I know you're busy, he continued, but I've been following your work, and I want to talk about something important, something that could change everything for you. Clara felt a pang of annoyance, but quickly pushed it aside. She had worked too hard to get to where she was. The last thing she wanted was to be drawn back into his orbit. I'm working on something important right now, Alexander, she said, trying to sound professional. I don't have time for a chat. Wait, Clara, he persisted, his tone softening. I'm not asking for your time in the way you think. I'm offering something more. I want to discuss a potential collaboration, a partnership, not just between us, but with several other key players in the industry. This could be your chance to scale your business beyond what you've imagined. Clara felt a flicker of intrigue, but she quickly tamped it down. She had learned enough over the years not to trust his words so easily. I don't need you to give me a leg up, she said, her voice firm. I've made my own way without your help. I know, he replied, his voice almost soothing. But this is different, Clara. This could change everything. For both of us. She felt the weight of his words hang in the air. Part of her wanted to hang up, to brush him off and continue with her life. But another part, one she hated for even considering it, wondered what he could possibly have in mind. Could she afford to ignore the opportunity? I'll think about it, Clara said, trying to keep her emotions in check. But right now, I have a meeting to attend. She ended the call quickly, her mind buzzing with conflicting thoughts. On the one hand, she was proud of what she had achieved on her own. She didn't need Alexander. But on the other hand, the offer he had made was too tempting to dismiss out of hand. What kind of partnership was he proposing? And was it something she could afford to turn down? As she prepared for her meeting with Emily, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads. Her career was taking off, and she was finally gaining the independence she had always craved. But Alexander's offer, whatever it was a reminder of the world she had once been a part of, a world she had left behind. She pushed those thoughts aside for now. She had a meeting to attend, and it was time to focus on the future. But deep down, Clara knew this wasn't over. Alexander wasn't going to let her go that easily. And that meant she would have to decide, once and for all, what kind of future she wanted to build, on her own or with his help. Clara didn't expect Alexander to reach out again so soon. But just a few days after their tense phone call, she found herself sitting at her desk, sipping coffee and reviewing the final designs for the tech company's headquarters when an email popped up on her screen. It was from him. Her heart skipped a beat as she clicked on the subject line, "Let's meet." The email was brief but to the point. "Clara, I know you're busy, but I'd like to discuss something important. Meet me at the usual place at 2 p.m. Alexander. She felt a wave of irritation rush over her. The usual place, the restaurant where they had dined countless times, where business deals and personal matters were often discussed under the pretense of casual meals. It was a place that held too many memories, too many unspoken feelings. But despite her better judgment, Clara found herself agreeing to the meeting. As the clock neared 2 p.m., Clara sat in her car, the city's bustle moving around her in a blur. She had come a long way since she had first stepped into Alexander's world, but that didn't mean she was prepared for what this meeting would hold. She had no idea what he wanted, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just a business discussion. When she entered the restaurant, Alexander was already seated at their usual table by the window, his back straight, his demeanor confident as ever. He didn't look up as she approached, but there was a subtle change in his posture, a slight shift as if he could sense her presence before she even spoke. "Clara," he said, his voice smooth, but with a note of something different in it. "I'm glad you could make it." "I didn't have much choice," she replied, her tone cool but polite as she took a seat across from him. "You made it clear that this was something urgent." He smiled, but there was no amusement in it, only the faintest trace of something more serious. "I understand if you're hesitant," he said, his eyes locking with hers, "but I'm hoping we can have an honest conversation. No more games, no more pretending. Just a real discussion about where we go from here." Clara raised an eyebrow. "From here? I thought we were already clear about where we stand, Alexander. You made it clear at the wedding that you wanted something from me. But now, I'm not sure if that was just business or something else entirely." He let out a long breath, leaning back in his chair. "It's complicated," he admitted, his eyes not leaving hers. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I know I haven't exactly made things easy for you." Clara frowned. "No, you haven't. But I don't need your apology, Alexander. What I need is transparency. If you want something from me, then you need to be clear about it." He nodded slowly, as if weighing her words carefully. "Fair enough. Let me be direct then. What I want, Clara, is for you to partner with me, not just on the projects we've worked on together, but on something bigger. I want us to build something substantial. You're at a pivotal moment in your career, and I believe I can offer you something that will elevate your business beyond what you can achieve on your own." Clara's heart skipped. A partnership with him? She had worked so hard to prove she didn't need him, that she could stand on her own, and now, here he was, offering her a chance to work alongside him in a way she had never imagined. "I've worked hard to get where I am, Alexander," she said, her voice steady but her mind racing. "I don't need your help." "I know you don't," he replied, his voice soft but insistent. "But this isn't about me helping you, Clara. It's about what we could accomplish together. I've seen your potential from the beginning. You're more than just my assistant, more than just a designer. You're a visionary, and I'm offering you the chance to expand that vision on a scale that you can't even fathom yet." She couldn't deny the appeal of his words. The projects he was offering sounded incredible, large-scale, influential, socially impactful. But at what cost? Was this truly an opportunity, or was he simply trying to pull her back into his world for his own gain? "I don't know," she said, leaning back in her chair, her arms crossed. "You talk about vision, but I'm not sure I trust your version of it. I've seen the way you work. You play the game with everyone, Alexander. Why should I believe this isn't just another move on your part?" His eyes softened, and for a moment, she thought she saw a glimpse of something. Vulnerability, perhaps. "I'm not asking you to trust me blindly, Clara. But what I am asking is for you to consider the possibility that we could do something great together. Something that could change the industry, that could change how people see us both." Clara was quiet for a long time, her mind working through everything he had said. She had come to this meeting prepared to shut him down, to walk away and continue forging her own path. But now, as she listened to him, she felt torn. This was the Alexander she had known, the one who was always calculating, always thinking 2 steps ahead. But there was something else here, too. Something deeper. Was he being honest, or was this just another game to him? "Why now?" she asked, her voice quieter now, probing. "Why reach out to me after everything that's happened? After the wedding?" He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. "Because I've realized something. I've been so focused on business, on the next deal, the next project, that I've overlooked what truly matters. And that's why I'm here. To offer you this partnership, not just because it's good for business, but because I think you deserve more than what you've been given." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara wasn't sure what to make of them. She wasn't sure if he was speaking from a place of sincerity, or if this was just another attempt to pull her back into his web. But there was one thing she did know. This was a defining moment. She could either take this offer and see where it led, or she could walk away, continuing to build her own future without his influence. For the first time in a long while, Clara felt a glimmer of possibility. It wasn't just the offer itself. It was the realization that she had a choice. She didn't have to rely on him. But maybe, just maybe, they could build something together that neither of them could accomplish alone. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. Alexander smiled, a genuine smile this time. "I'll give you all the time you need, Clara. But when you're ready, let me know. I'm here." As she left the restaurant, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Maybe this wasn't the end of their story, after all. Maybe it was just the beginning. Clara spent the next few days in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, torn between the possibilities Alexander had laid out before her and the deep-seated doubts that gnawed at her. His offer was tempting, no doubt. He was offering access to resources, networks, and opportunities she had only dreamed of. The idea of working alongside him on large-scale projects had a magnetic pull. But with every passing hour, Clara felt the weight of her own independence pressing against her desire for something more. She knew that her career had flourished on her own terms, through sheer determination and hard work. She had built something from the ground up, and every step had been a victory over the obstacles life had thrown at her. She had finally broken free from the shadows of the past, distancing herself from Alexander and the complexities of their past relationship. But now, his offer felt like an intrusion. Still, as the days stretched on, she couldn't escape the fact that the world Alexander was offering her was vastly different from the one she currently inhabited. It was a world where influence and power were at the tip of her fingers, an enticing thought, but one that also came with the potential for manipulation and control. Could she trust him? Could she really work with someone whose motives had always seemed unclear, whose methods were often unpredictable? One evening, after a particularly grueling day working on designs for Emily's tech company, Clara found herself sitting at her desk, staring at her laptop screen without really seeing it. Her mind kept circling back to Alexander's words. He hadn't just offered a business partnership. He had admitted, for the first time, that he saw something in her. Something more than just a designer, more than just his assistant. He had told her that he believed in her potential, that he wanted her to be a part of something bigger. The problem, Clara realized, wasn't the partnership itself, it was the trust. She couldn't ignore the reality that Alexander had often used people for his own gain, seen them as tools to help him climb higher. And though he seemed more genuine now, more vulnerable, there was always that lingering question. Was this a fresh start, or was he simply trying to draw her back into his orbit for reasons she hadn't fully grasped? It was in this moment of quiet reflection that Clara made a decision. She would meet with him again, but this time, there would be no pretending. She would confront him with the questions that had been plaguing her, the questions about his motivations, his past, and his true feelings for her. She needed answers, not just to make a decision about the partnership, but to understand the man behind the offer. The next morning, Clara sent Alexander a brief text, asking him to meet at the same restaurant. He agreed immediately, and as the time approached, she felt a knot form in her stomach. She had always prided herself on being calm, collected, and professional, but this felt different. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. When she arrived, Alexander was already seated, his posture as composed as ever, his eyes shadowed with something unreadable. He looked up as she approached, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her heart flutter despite herself. "Clara," he said softly, his voice almost too gentle, "I'm glad you could make it." "I didn't come here to make small talk," Clara said, cutting to the chase. "I came because I need answers. About the offer. About you." Alexander's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, but he didn't flinch. He nodded slowly. "I expected as much," he said. "Ask away." Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Why now, Alexander? Why come to me after everything that's happened? You know the history between us, the dynamics we've shared. I've spent years building my own career, making my own way. And then, after the wedding, you show up with an offer. Why?" He paused, his gaze softening for the briefest of moments. "Because I've been wrong. For a long time, I've been focused on the wrong things. I've chased power, influence, and status, thinking they would give me control over everything. But the truth is, Clara, you were always more than just an assistant to me. From the very beginning, I saw your potential. And over time, I realized that the way I treated you, using you for my own purposes, was a mistake." Clara's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to admit it so plainly, so openly. But still, doubts lingered. "You've used people before, Alexander," Clara said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And I'm not blind to the fact that your career is built on the backs of others. You can't just sweep that away with a few words. What's changed now? What's really changed?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "I've changed, Clara. I'm not the same man I was when we first met. I've spent so much time chasing the approval of my father, of others, that I've lost sight of who I am and who I want to be. I've made mistakes, but I'm trying to make up for them. I'm offering you this partnership because I believe we can do something extraordinary together. Not just for business, but for the world. You and I, we have the ability to change things, real things, important things." Clara leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. His words sounded sincere. For the first time, he wasn't just trying to sell her an idea. He was confessing, laying bare the reality of who he had been and who he wanted to become. But still, that old fear lingered in her chest. Could she trust him? Could she take this leap and enter a partnership with a man who had once treated her as little more than a tool? "What happens if I say no?" Clara asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. "What happens if I turn you down and continue on my own path?" He didn't hesitate. "Then I will respect your decision, Clara, but I don't think you'll make that choice. Not because of what I want, but because of what you deserve. You deserve more than to go it alone. You've always deserved more." His words hung in the air like a weight, pressing on her chest, filling her with the tension of a choice yet to be made. Clara sat in silence for a long moment, her mind spinning with thoughts of the future, of what could be. She had come here to confront him, to demand the truth. And now, she had the truth. But what would she do with it? Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "I'll think about it," she said again. But this time, there was something different in her tone. There was a hint of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something together. Or maybe she would walk away and prove that she didn't need him at all. But for the first time, Clara wasn't sure. The future was wide open, and she had a decision to make. Clara spent the next few days deep in contemplation. The weight of Alexander's words lingered, his offer gnawing at her, pulling her in one direction, while the memory of her independence tugged her in another. She had built everything she had alone, meticulously crafting her career, her reputation, and her identity. Yet, there was something undeniably magnetic about Alexander's offer. A chance to do something bigger, to have a hand in projects that could leave a lasting mark on the world. Despite herself, Clara found herself imagining what such a partnership could look like. She had already proven her worth on her own. This was different. This was about taking her ideas, her passion, and her drive and merging them with Alexander's resources, connections, and reach. It could open doors that she couldn't even begin to unlock by herself. But the question remained, could she trust him? Could she build something with him? Not just as business partners, but as people who had once been so close, so intertwined, yet so far apart? She met with him again, a few days later, at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, a more neutral space than the restaurant they had frequented. This time, she was prepared to make a decision, whether to accept his offer and take the leap or to walk away, determined to continue forging her own path. When she arrived, Alexander was already sitting at a table in the corner, his usual composed self, but there was something different in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability, an openness that hadn't been there before. It was as if he knew this moment was pivotal for both of them. She walked over, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and sat down across from him. "You're early," she remarked, trying to break the tension that hung thick between them. "I had a feeling you'd come," he said, his voice light but with an undercurrent of sincerity. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said last time, and I've come to realize something important. You're right. You don't need me, but I still believe in what we could do together. And I'm willing to show you that it's not just about business. It's about creating something meaningful." Clara met his gaze, feeling a flicker of something within her chest. His words were different this time. Not the strategic, calculated pitch she had heard before, but something closer to honesty, even vulnerability. She let out a breath, realizing she was more uncertain than ever. "All right," Clara said, finally breaking the silence. "Let's talk about what this would actually look like. What do you propose?" Alexander smiled slightly, as though he had been waiting for her to ask. "We start small. There are a few projects in the works that I think you could take the lead on. I'll provide the resources, the financial backing, and the platform to launch your designs on a larger scale. You take the reins, but we'll work side by side, using our combined strengths to push the boundaries of what's possible. We'll focus on sustainability, social impact, things that matter." Clara leaned forward, intrigued but cautious. "And what's in it for you?" He didn't flinch, his eyes steady. "A partnership that can reshape industries. A chance to do something more than just build wealth. A chance to change the world. But also, there's something personal in it for me. I've spent too much time trying to control everything, and in the process, I've lost sight of the things that really matter. I want to work with someone who believes in making a difference, someone who pushes me to be better. That's why I came to you, Clara. I see what you're capable of, and I know that we can do something together that will make a real impact." Clara remained silent for a moment, considering his words. He wasn't offering her a partnership just for the sake of business. He was offering something deeper, an opportunity to change, to grow, not just professionally but personally. He was willing to take a chance on her, and more importantly, he was asking her to take a chance on him. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice a little softer. "I've worked hard to get to where I am. I don't want to lose myself in this. I've seen what happens when people get too caught up in business, too caught up in power. I don't want that for myself." Alexander nodded, understanding. "I don't want that for you either, Clara. That's why I'm offering this partnership, not as a way to control you, but as a way to give you the space and resources you need to shine. You've proven you can do it on your own. I'm just offering you a platform to take your work to the next level. But it's your vision, your leadership. I respect that, and I want to see you succeed on your own terms." Clara stared at him for a long time, weighing his words. She had spent so many years being cautious, building walls to protect herself from people who wanted to take advantage of her. She had learned to trust herself, to trust her instincts, but trusting someone else, that was a different matter altogether. And yet, here he was, offering her the very thing she had wanted. The chance to do something bigger, to change the world in a way that felt meaningful. "I'm in," she said, finally making the decision. Her voice was firm, Yet there was a hint of uncertainty beneath it. She wasn't entirely sure where this partnership would take her, but she knew it was the right step forward. She had nothing left to prove to herself, but this was the chance to prove to the world that her vision could make a difference. Alexander's eyes lit up with an emotion Clara hadn't seen before. Gratitude, perhaps, or even relief. "You won't regret this," he said, his voice low but full of conviction. "I promise." The next few months passed in a blur. They dove headfirst into their collaboration, each day bringing new challenges, new ideas, and new discoveries. Clara's designs, which had once been limited to small-scale projects, were now being developed on a grand scale, supported by the resources Alexander had offered. They worked closely, side by side, learning from each other, pushing each other to be better. As they built their partnership, they also built something more, a mutual respect and understanding that grew deeper with each passing day. But it wasn't just about business. Slowly, Clara began to see a side of Alexander that she had never known. The side of him that was vulnerable, introspective, and genuinely invested in the work they were doing. It wasn't just about making money or gaining influence. It was about something more lasting, something meaningful. And with every success, every milestone they reached together, Clara began to realize that Alexander wasn't just offering her a business partnership. He was offering her a chance at a different kind of future, one where they could both make a real difference in the world. But even as they achieved new heights in their work, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was unfolding between them. The more they collaborated, the more she saw how much he had changed, how much he had grown. And with that change came an unsettling thought. Could she allow herself to trust him again? Could she allow herself to care for him in a way she hadn't thought possible? For the first time in a long while, Clara was unsure of what the future held. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't facing it alone. It had been months since Clara had made the decision to join forces with Alexander. The whirlwind of their collaboration had consumed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every day, they pushed boundaries together, both in business and in their understanding of one another. What started as a professional partnership had slowly transformed into something deeper, something more personal. It wasn't just the projects that kept Clara at his side. It was the way Alexander had changed, the way he treated her with respect, the way he valued her opinions, and the trust he now placed in her. She had seen him at his most vulnerable and at his most driven, and in both states, there was a depth to him that she had never imagined. As their projects began to take shape, groundbreaking, sustainable designs that would reshape industries, Clara found herself questioning her initial doubts. Could she trust him? Could they truly build something lasting, both professionally and personally? She no longer felt like the cautious woman she had been when she first entered this partnership. She was stronger now, more confident in her own abilities, and she began to recognize that maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated the possibility of a future with Alexander. But despite the success they were experiencing, Clara couldn't shake the sense of tension that lingered between them. Alexander had been more attentive than ever, often staying late to work alongside her, offering his insights and support. Their connection was undeniable, and the chemistry between them was palpable. Yet, he had not once acknowledged the underlying shift in their relationship. He had not mentioned the possibility of something more, not since their earlier discussions about trust and boundaries. Clara had always prided herself on keeping things professional, but as time passed, she couldn't ignore the way her heart began to race when Alexander was near, the way her thoughts strayed to him when they were apart. She had worked hard to build her career and to protect her independence, but in the quiet moments, she found herself wondering if it was time to let go of her reservations. The question she had been avoiding for months now resurfaced. Was this just business, or was there something more between them? On the night of the grand launch of their latest project, a sustainable initiative that would garner widespread attention, Clara arrived at the venue feeling a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The event was a culmination of everything they had worked for. The designs, the collaborations, the late nights, and the press was buzzing with anticipation. She had never been part of something so high-profile, but there was a quiet pride within her. This was her vision, realized with Alexander's backing. The event was a resounding success. Journalists and industry leaders mingled, praising the boldness and innovation of the designs. while Clara and Alexander worked the room with ease. Yet, through all the applause and accolades, Clara couldn't help but notice the way Alexander kept his attention on her. His gaze lingered a little too long, his words a little more thoughtful, as if he were seeing her in a new light. And in those moments, when their eyes met, she couldn't deny the way her pulse quickened. As the evening wore on, the event began to wind down. Clara was in the middle of a conversation with a potential investor when she felt a hand gently rest on her shoulder. She turned, and there stood Alexander, his expression unreadable but full of intent. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "can we talk?" A sudden flutter of nerves rippled through her. She excused herself from the conversation, and together, they moved to a quieter part of the venue, away from the crowd. The soft glow of the city lights filtered through the large windows, casting a gentle light over the room. For a moment, they stood in silence, neither of them speaking, both aware of the gravity of the moment. "Everything went so well tonight," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady, but her heart was beating faster with every passing second. "It did," Alexander agreed, his gaze never leaving her. "And I owe so much of it to you. Your work, your vision. It's changed everything for me. Not just professionally, but personally." Clara felt a twinge of uncertainty. "I'm just doing my job," she replied, though the words felt inadequate in the face of everything they had accomplished together. "No, Clara," Alexander said, taking a step closer. "You're doing more than that. You've opened my eyes to something I didn't even know I was missing. You've helped me become a better man, not just a better businessman. And for that, I'll always be grateful." She looked up at him, her chest tight with emotion. She had never heard him speak this way before, never felt the vulnerability in his words. It was as if he had peeled back the layers that had kept him guarded for so long. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he continued, his voice soft but filled with resolve. "About us. About everything we've built together. I know we've had our differences, and I know I've made mistakes in the past, but I've learned so much from you, Clara. I've seen what we can do together, and I believe we can do so much more." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped, she had wondered, but hearing him say the words aloud was something she hadn't been prepared for. "I'm not asking for everything to change overnight," Alexander said, his eyes searching hers. "But I need to ask you something important, something that goes beyond business." He took a step forward, closing the space between them, his presence overwhelming. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, and she found herself unable to speak. She had no idea what he was going to say, but the intensity in his eyes told her it was something life-changing. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady, "I want to build a life with you. Not just projects, not just business, but something more, something real. I'm asking you to trust me, to trust us, and to take this leap with me. Will you marry me?" Time seemed to stand still. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Clara felt a rush of emotions flood her. Surprise, joy, disbelief, and something deeper. Something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. She searched his face for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. He was looking at her with complete sincerity, with the kind of openness that had been missing in their past. This wasn't just a business proposal. This was something more. Clara's mind raced, the years of self-doubt, the fears of losing her independence, all swirling around her. But as she looked at Alexander, she saw the man he had become. The man who had shown her respect, who had supported her growth, and who had finally learned what it meant to love and to trust. For the first time, Clara felt certain. She knew this was the next step. It wasn't just about love. It was about building something that would last, something that they could both be proud of. Together. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, her heart full. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." He smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing, and he took her hand in his. "You won't regret this," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I promise." In that moment, as the crowd outside continued to celebrate their success, Clara realized that their journey was just beginning. They had already accomplished so much together, but now they were about to build a life, a future, where love and ambition could coexist. And for the first time, Clara wasn't afraid of the future. She was ready for it. As weeks turned into months, Clara found herself fully immersed in the life she and Alexander had begun to build together. Their engagement had been met with surprise from many of their colleagues, but it wasn't just the business world that had noticed their shift in relationship. It was their friends, their families, and even the press. The once distant, professional relationship between them had evolved into something far more intimate, and Clara knew that everything was about to change. At first, they kept their personal lives under wraps, focusing on the completion of their major project, the sustainable initiative that had brought them to this pivotal point. It wasn't just about the accolades anymore. It was about the impact they could make on the world. Every decision, every late-night meeting, and every idea they developed was a step closer to their shared vision, and Clara had never felt more alive. She was no longer just a part of Alexander's world. She was an equal, a partner, someone whose voice mattered just as much as his, and she had learned to love him, not just for the man he had become, but for the way he had made her feel seen, heard, and valued. Still, despite the professional success they shared, there were moments of doubt, moments when Clara wondered if the world they were building together would truly be enough. Could they balance the growing pressures of their careers with the intimacy they were now nurturing? Could they find harmony between their individual ambitions and the life they both wanted to create? These questions hovered in Clara's mind, but every time she looked at Alexander, she found herself reassured. His constant presence in her life, the way he encouraged her growth, and the way he had begun to put her first, gave her the strength to believe that together they could face anything. The proposal had marked the beginning of a new chapter for them both, but it wasn't until they began planning their wedding that Clara truly understood the depth of Alexander's commitment. The wedding was not going to be an extravagant, over-the-top affair like many of the galas they had attended over the years. Instead, they decided to make it personal, intimate, an event that reflected their journey. There were no grand gestures, no elaborate venues, just a simple ceremony, surrounded by close friends, colleagues who had become family, and the people who had witnessed the evolution of their relationship. As the wedding day approached, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of calm. She had spent so many years building her career, establishing her independence, that she had never considered that she might one day want something different, something more. But now, as she stood beside Alexander, planning a future that was as much hers as it was his, she realized that the foundation they had built together was stronger than any individual accomplishment. It wasn't about one person's success. It was about what they could accomplish as a team. On the morning of their wedding, Clara stood in front of a mirror, wearing a simple but elegant white gown that had been handpicked for her by Alexander. The dress wasn't the most extravagant, but it was beautiful, just like the life they had been creating together. Her reflection, framed by the soft light of the room, seemed to capture everything she had come to realize over the past few months. She was ready. Ready for love, ready for the future, and ready for the life she and Alexander would build together. It wasn't just about business. It wasn't about success. It was about partnership, trust, and mutual respect, the things that would sustain them for years to come. As Clara looked at herself in the mirror, she couldn't help but think back to where it all started. She had been so uncertain then, so wary of getting involved with Alexander. But now, everything seemed to fall into place. Her heart felt at peace, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of belonging that transcended anything she had experienced before. The ceremony itself was small but beautiful. Alexander, dressed in a classic black suit, looked at Clara with such warmth in his eyes that she nearly forgot to breathe. The vows they exchanged were personal, heartfelt promises to support one another, to always strive to be better, for each other, and for the world they would change together. The simplicity of the moment, just the two of them, surrounded by people who loved and supported them, was more profound than any grand wedding could have been. As they sealed their vows with a kiss, Clara felt a sense of joy she hadn't expected. This wasn't the end of their journey. It was just the beginning. There would be challenges, of course. There would be hard days, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But they had already faced so much together, and with the strength of their partnership, Clara knew they could handle anything. Their reception was just as intimate, filled with laughter, heartfelt speeches, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had truly built something meaningful. People who had once viewed Alexander as a solitary figure, driven only by business, now saw him in a different light. He was more than just a billionaire. He was a man who had learned to love, to open himself to others, and to embrace vulnerability. And Clara, the woman who had entered his life with skepticism and caution, had shown him a path toward a life that was fuller, richer, and more rewarding than any amount of success could offer. As the evening wound down and they shared a quiet moment together, away from the crowd, Alexander turned to Clara with a soft smile. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Clara nodded, her heart full. "We have," she said, her voice steady, "but I think we've only just begun." And with that, they walked hand in hand into their new life, one where love and ambition would coexist, where they would continue to grow together, supporting each other in ways neither of them had ever imagined. It wasn't just the success of their business that mattered anymore. It was the life they had built, a life founded on trust, respect, and love, a life that would continue to flourish, no matter what the future held. For Clara and Alexander, the best was yet to come. As Clara and Alexander embarked on this new chapter of their lives, they both understood that their journey had only just begun. The road ahead would not always be easy, but they had learned one invaluable lesson. True success is not measured by wealth or achievements, but by the strength of the bonds we form with those we love and trust. Together, they had built more than a business empire. They had created a life, a partnership grounded in respect, understanding, and love. Their shared vision for the future, where their personal and professional lives intertwined seamlessly, was not just a dream, but a reality they were living every day. And as they stood side by side, facing the world with confidence, Clara knew one thing for certain. No matter what challenges came their way, they were ready to face them, together. The future was theirs to shape, and they would build it with the same determination, passion, and heart that had brought them this far. Whatever came next, they were no longer two separate individuals, but a united force, a partnership destined for greatness. And in each other, they had found the most unexpected yet perfect home. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. Your support means the world, and I hope you enjoyed every twist and turn of the journey with Clara and Alexander. If you like this story, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more exciting content. Also, feel free to share this video with anyone who might enjoy it. Your feedback and engagement truly help us grow, so leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Stay tuned for more stories coming your way, and thank you again for being part of this amazing journey. See you in the next one.